Mr. Chairman,
Articles of Confederation now resolve this convention. The national government ought to be established.
Consent to this Constitution.
Welcome to Lesson 4. Here we're going to talk about the Founders' first attempt to find the balanced center. Once the Founding Fathers made the decision to declare independence, they knew they had to formulate a structure of government that would unite the colonies into a solid national unit. Before the Declaration of Independence was announced, a committee was appointed to begin drafting the Articles of Confederation. Little did the founders realize that it would be nearly 11 years before they would know how to put together a sound constitution for a free, prosperous people. In 1776, they still had much to learn. As Thomas Jefferson wrote, "We had never been permitted to exercise self-government. When forced to assume it, we were novices in its science." So now we're going to talk a little bit about those Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation, when the founders put it together, you got to realize they just got done being under the strong arm of the king. And so they wanted to make sure that they didn't have this tyranny that they had just experienced. And so there's a couple things that they didn't put in the Articles of Confederation. Number one, on page 23, they didn't put in an executive. No executive. Executive's your blank. No federal judiciary system. Judicial is your blank there. No federal judicial system. Now, the founders believed that most of the judicial system could exist on the state level. And so that's why they didn't put it here in the Articles of Confederation. There was no power to tax. Tax is your next blank. And no power to enforce its decrees. So essentially, the Articles of Confederation were nothing more than just a committee of the states that would pass some resolutions and hope and pray that the states would follow them, which they almost never did. And so there's these key weaknesses in the Articles of Confederation. Now, if you turn the page, you'll see that diagram between tyranny and anarchy, ruler's law and no law, and you'll see that the Articles of Confederation were placed a little bit too far toward anarchy. Anarchy is your blank for letter B. And it stands to reason. Again, they were responding to a very heavy hand of government, and so they wanted to make sure that that heavy hand didn't exist in the United States. Now, Washington was the one that felt the weakness of the Articles of Confederation the most, because he was really the only federal entity. Congress was the other federal entity, but it was made up of representatives from the various states. And so they didn't really feel the weakness as much as George Washington did, as George Washington was trying to fight the Revolutionary War. And so he was always on the razor's edge of defeat. Defeat is your blank. Truly, it was a miracle war. Now, you'll notice this list here where we talk about some of the major battles that existed during the Revolutionary War. As we go through this list, I'm going to tell you either A or B, Americans, if they won that battle, or B for British, if the British won that battle. So we'll go through this quickly. So we've got Boston, Americans. Charleston, Americans. New York, British. Trenton, of course you see the date there, December 26th, the Americans. That's the famous story of Washington crossing the Delaware, right? Then Princeton, right after that, Americans, A for American. Ticonderoga, B for British. Bennington, A for Americans. And the next one, Freeman's Farm, is D for draw. It's a tie. There's no clear victor there. Then we'll go through a few more of these. I'm going to start just telling you by the number there. So 15 is A, Americans. 16 is B, Brandywine, British. 17 is B, Germantown. Monmouth was another D for draw on 18. 19, British, B for British. 20, A for Americans. Savannah is B, British. Charleston, B for British. Camden is B for British. Then here we have Kings Mountain. Kings Mountain is a wonderful story. Here you have, who was it? Major Patrick Ferguson. He was a British officer, and he was quite violent. He was ruthless. He burned and pillaged the homes of Americans, and he really caused a lot of problem. And so he was there at Kings Mountain. His goal was to hold off the Americans from being able to come and attack Cornwallis. And so he was kind of hanging on to Cornwallis's flank there. And so he took and fortified himself on the top of Kings Mountain. Some say this is where King of the Hill, that game that we played as a kid, comes from. But Kings Mountain, he's up there on top of that, and very difficult to take the high ground. So he thought for sure there was no problem. And he did know that the rebels were coming up. He called them rebels. They were coming up, and they were getting ready to attack Kings Mountain. And he very boldly and arrogantly declared that neither God nor these rebels could dislodge him from atop this mountain. Well, before the war was over, those Americans sent him back to his maker to make peace with that statement. Right? Although it ended up being a prophetic statement, because Major Patrick Ferguson was right. He was never dislodged from atop that mountain, because he can still be found in a shallow grave right where he died, at the top of Kings Mountain. So even today, you see his grave right there. But nevertheless, it was some mountain men from Tennessee that came and with those long rifles, these marksmen, and they were able to take the hill. And they prevented Patrick Ferguson from being able to protect Cornwallis's flank. And so a great story there about Kings Mountain. So A for Americans on that one, obviously. Number 25, Cowpens is A. And then number 26, B, British. Now, if you were to add up how many A's and how many B's you have there, you'll notice you're at an equal number. Okay? And so you've got, literally, you're seeing how George Washington fought the war on the razor's edge of defeat. And then we come to the remarkable events that led to Yorktown. What ended up happening was Cornwallis, because of Patrick Ferguson's defeat, and also because of another situation that happened that where the Americans were able to defeat another one of his units there that were trying to protect him, he ended up basically retreating to Yorktown and found himself up against the York River. Now, he was in a fairly good position. He thought he could defend it because he knew that his British ships would be able to come up to the York River and evacuate them if they needed to. Well, what ended up happening was Washington was up near New York. He was ready to take New York. And the plan was that the French were going to take their fleet of ships into New York and help him take New York. Well, the French decided that they didn't want to be up in New York. The weather's not as pleasant there and things, so they wanted to be down near Virginia in that area because it's a little bit more mild. And so when Washington heard this, rather than being too upset, he took advantage of the opportunity. And he acted like he was making preparations to retake New York. And so the British started gearing up all their reinforcements, and they began preparing. They even brought their ships up and started just getting ready for Washington's attack. Well, Washington ended up skipping town quick as possible, and before they even knew what was happening, he was already halfway to Yorktown because he forced marched his soldiers down to Yorktown to meet Cornwallis, and it was a total surprise. Well, it ended up being pretty good that the French decided to seal off that Chesapeake because it made it so that Cornwallis could not get supplies, and he couldn't escape with his troops. And so thus the battle began. The battle went on for another number of days, and finally Cornwallis, out of desperation, decided to try to escape with himself and his officers and his troops. And so they began to load up in boats on the York River, and they piled into those boats, and they went ahead and launched, and wouldn't you know it, a wind came up and slammed those boats back to the bank. And Cornwallis said, "It looks as if even God himself is on Washington's side. And so Cornwallis is forced to stay there and eventually ended up having to surrender. And so incredible events that led to Yorktown, which was the last major battle of the Revolutionary War, which you can put an A there because of the victory that took place at Yorktown. So just an incredible event with Washington being able to do that. Now, what ended up happening was Cornwallis was one of the greatest military minds in the world at the time. And so it was absolutely shameful that he had lost, because they knew that the war was essentially over, and it was Cornwallis's fault. And so he was so ashamed that he refused to go out and give his sword in surrender to George Washington. So instead, he sent one of his aides. And so his aide came out with the sword, and he went to give it to George Washington, and George Washington said, "Oh, you give it to one of my aides. If you're not going to send it, if you're not going to come out yourself, then your aide is going to give it to my aide." And so the aides were the ones that actually exchanged the sword of surrender. But Cornwallis went home in shame, in defeat, and as a result, there was a couple of other skirmishes after that, but essentially this was the end of the Revolutionary War. But George Washington, he had kept writing letters back to Congress, talking about what the positions were and victories and failures and things. And somebody went through all those letters. He sent weekly letters back, and they went through all those letters. And on 67 occasions, George Washington attributed some occasion or event directly to the hand of God. And so he definitely recognized that the victory came as a miracle, not because of the Articles of Confederation. There were times when the state was doing fairly well, or the country was, and they could afford to send supplies, but they failed to do so because the Articles of Confederation were so weak and didn't have any power to get those supplies. There were times when George Washington had to enter into communities and take supplies. It's amazing that he still was revered as much as he was, because there were times when he had to be a tyrant to come in and feed his soldiers. The country was doing fairly well during Valley Forge, and even next year, even the worst winter. So while our soldiers were starving and eating bad meat and stale bread and didn't have shoes and blankets, for the most part, the rest of the country was doing okay. And so it's very disappointing. And Washington attributes that near failure of the Revolutionary War directly to the Articles of Confederation. And so you see that those were a failure. The founders' first attempt to write their first Constitution didn't work out so well. And so that's a very quick lesson, and then we'll continue on with the Constitutional Convention. Thank you.